The question reads, do the rapid tests work anymore, especially for these new variants? It's sort of a complex multi-part answer, so buckle in. So first, rapid antigen tests are lateral flow assays. How they work is you take your sample. If your sample has COVID in it, that will be in the sample. So you swab your nose, put it into that liquid, and then in that liquid, there are little molecules that will bind to COVID. And then those little molecules that have bonded to COVID will bond to the antibody that's plated on the actual test strip itself. So if the bonded part with COVID interacts with the antibody that has been plated on the paper, then it will cause a color change, and that will tell you if you are COVID positive or not. Therefore, the first major factor that influences rapid antigen testing is your sampling technique. What we have learned is that there are three major inoculation sites for COVID. It can occur in your eyes, in your nose, and in your mouth. So, wherever you are predominantly infected, that will have the highest expression of COVID, and then this will vary in different levels depending on where you are infected. However, an infection of the eyes will still show up in the nose, an infection in the nose will still show up in the mouth, infection in the mouth will still show up in the nose, because it's all connected. So, because of this, the sampling technique that's preferred is now a cheek, a back of the tongue or throat swab, and a nasal swab all combined. This allows for the greatest chance of sampling COVID on your Q-tip. So, for example, if you consumed COVID and you picked it up orally, such as through kissing an infected person, if you do just a nasal swab, you might not be picking up the high expression in your oral cavity in your mouth. Furthermore, there's that standard sampling error where if you don't go deep enough into your nose, your nasal cavity, to actually swab the membrane, the mucous membrane that's past that hairy region of your nose. So if you have poor sampling technique, depending on the viral load, this can create anything from a 20% to an 80% reduction in your chance of actually picking up the COVID positive if you are COVID positive. The next major factor is the time to peak viral load. Initially, the peak viral load was the day before symptoms or within 24 hours of symptoms was when you would have that peak viral load. So you would want to test very quickly and get that positive test result. However, now in 2024, the most current literature shows that the highest viral load is days 3 to 5 after symptoms, after the onset of symptoms, meaning that if you're getting negatives before that time period, it might just not have peaked at a high enough viral load to even be detectable on your test. So the general rule now is once symptoms start to test on days 1, 3, and 5. I would recommend also going to day 7 just in case. So that timing to the peak viral load is very important because if you do it too soon, you're going to get a COVID negative result, and that will be a false COVID negative, and that's because you tested prior to when it would be detectable. Next, there's test contamination. This can occur from recently eating or recently having used a mouthwash or nasal spray prior to taking the test. Things like coffee or tea can temporarily inactivate COVID for about 5 minutes, with similar effects of nasal spray. Mouthwash, if it has cetyl pyridinium chloride, CPC active ingredient, then that will inactivate COVID in your mouth for a decent chunk of time, a couple hours. So if you do any of those things prior to taking the test, you could also get a false negative result. Next, is your test in date or is it expired? If your test is expired, you could get a false negative again. This is because the test will degrade over time as everything degrades over time, which will mean that those plated antibodies on that test paper will actually fall off. So that color change would then happen at the end of the strip out of view than where it's supposed to. After that, we have the target antigen for the test. So does that rapid antigen test target the spike protein or the nucleocapsid protein, the S protein or the N protein? Most rapid antigen tests will target the nucleocapsid protein. This is because historically it's been more stable. However, it has started mutating very slowly, much more slowly than the spike protein, but still it has occurred. So if the test is targeted towards the spike protein, especially with newer variants, it will be very unlikely to actually pick up the COVID variants. So it'll depend if there's a single target, if it's the S protein, the N protein, or if it's targeting both, because some tests actually will target both. And as that implies, that also means it's important to select an appropriate test, as not all of these tests are created equal. So all of these different factors are going to play a role, but now let's go into the history of everything. Initially, all of the rapid antigen testing, the RATs or RATs, were approved under FDA emergency use authorization. This is a special approval pathway that you can read about here, but in essence, it means that because of the severity of the occurrence of the disease, like having a pandemic, A lower burden or standard of proof is needed to approve a test. And a large majority of our rapid antigen tests are still only approved under emergency use authorization. So, when will this end? Well, there's the PrEP Act for COVID 19 related information. This was signed on May 9th, 2023, and it allows these tests to continue being used until December 31st, 2024. So, how is an emergency use authorization different than an FDA approval? Under emergency use authorization, the FDA authorizes uses of medical products based on a reasonable belief that the product may be effective based on the best evidence available at the time without waiting for all the information that would be needed for an FDA approval. Examples of COVID rapid tests that are only approved under emergency use authorization include Binax Now and QuickView. Now, the first COVID rapid test that was approved under the traditional FDA approval pathway was the Q COVID 19 molecular test. This is still considered a rapid test, but it's not a lateral flow assay. It's a nucleic acid amplification test, so it's more similar to PCR. But that was the first at home over the counter test for COVID 19 to be granted this approval, and that was on June 6th of 2023. Following that, on November 9th, 2023, FlowFlex was the actual first lateral flow assay that was approved for over the counter use. And it's also the first COVID rapid test that is indicated for use in children under 18. It is cleared for individuals age 14 years and older, or adults testing individuals age 2 and older, where it can correctly identify a COVID positive test in about 90% of samples. So, outside of FlowFlex, what other COVID rapid tests have been granted traditional FDA approval? These tests include FlowFlex, FlowFlex Plus, HealGen, NanoCheck, Sophia 2, and QuickView. So that's interesting that in the quick Google search that it's still listed as not approved by the FDA when the FDA lists it as approved. So they likely have to update that on the Google page. So those ones are really the only rapid tests I would be using personally. I personally use FlowFlex, which then brings us to our last point. Is the test a single target test or a multi-target test? And of the single targets, which target is it selecting? A single target test is designed to detect only one antigen, currently either a section of the spike protein or a section of the nucleocapsid protein, so the S protein or the N protein. And selecting just one target makes it more susceptible to changes in performance due to viral mutations, especially if the target is the spike protein. Meaning that if the rapid antigen test is targeted to the spike protein, it is then more likely to fail to detect new variants, especially since these tests were designed to match variants that existed 3 to 4 years ago, where multi target tests appear to perform better across different variants and are more likely to continue to perform as labeled as new variants continue to emerge. So, if the test is targeting both the N and S proteins, then it's more likely to pick up new variants. Now, believe it or not, that is the long story short. So, in synopsis, to the question if the tests work anymore, it ultimately depends. On some of the tests, yes, absolutely, they will pick up current variants. On other tests, no, not so much.